I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you today about the plague that we have been suffering from since 1906, but it's grown more and more, particularly since the 1970s. It's the plague of all these federal bureaucracies. Bureaucracy is the way impersonal government imposes its power on people. It makes a mockery of all our elections. When we elect people, they come and go, but the bureaucrats are there forever. And one of the basic features of our Constitution is it was supposed to make sure that no one was in office who was not elected or at least appointed by someone who was elected and completely controlled by someone who was elected. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's what a Republican form of government is, where everyone who holds office and therefore any power over the people is accountable and can be removed by people who are accountable. And all of those bureaucracies do the opposite. And that's what makes them more and more powerful, because there's no real check on them. And that's been compounded by multiple violations of the guarantee clause, which I've talked about, which are the product of the existence of these public employee unions. The public employee unions negotiate directly with the federal government. They do this at the state level, and it's even more unconstitutional there. But it's completely unconstitutional in both of them. They negotiate directly with the government. And in the case of many of the officials in the government who they negotiate with, those officials are really in their pocket, because what these public employee unions do is they extort huge amounts of money from their members. They pretend to represent their members, but they really represent themselves and whatever ideology they're promoting. And the ideology they are always promoting is always the ideology of bureaucracy. There's only one ideology that is based on the imposition of bureaucracy on the people, and that's Marxism. They are inherently Marxism. Any bureaucracy that's created that is not actively dedicated to opposing Marxism invariably becomes Marxist. And that's a sort of my interpretation of a statement that was made by somebody else, someone who used to write for National Review, if I recall. I think it's called the Sullivan Rule. But it's true of any organization, and that's what bureaucracies are. They are self-centered organizations that pretend to do what they are enacted to do, but they never do that. Because once they're created, they have a life of their own. The first one was the Interstate Commerce Commission. It was created in 1878. There were no federal bureaucracies before that, at least not like that. There were federal civil servants, but they didn't have any power to impose their will on businesses, on the markets the markets that provide us with everything that we want to buy and which sell to us whatever we want. That's what businesses do. They're the providers. And yes, we pay for it. That's how they make profits. And that's what keeps them in business. And it's the voluntary buying and selling, which is what Karl Marx detested. It's what he used a German slander. He called it capitalism. What it is it's simply the free market. It's what happens when people buy and sell, enter into contracts between themselves freely within the bounds of law. They're not allowed to contract to do things like murder people or rape women. They're not allowed to do that. But the common law recognized limitations on freedom of contract. They're very limited. Fraud is one. They're not allowed to commit fraud, things like that. But the common law created all the constraints that are present for contracts between people. And what every one of those administrative agencies does is it violates the most basic thing that's in the Constitution. It's called freedom of contract. Freedom of contract is what differentiates slaves, or rather serfs, from free men. In medieval England, and of course throughout Europe, serfs had a particular attribute that made them different from free people. and that was they had no freedom of contract. That's why that is the one individual liberty that is enshrined in the original text of the Constitution, before the Bill of Rights, before they actually wrote out freedom of speech and religion and all that other stuff that's in the Bill of Rights. Those are all in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. But freedom of contract, which is in the Constitution, was there from the beginning, because we were all supposed to be free citizens in this country, the freest citizens in the world. We were supposed to have all the rights that were limited basically just to noblemen in Europe. But in America, every man was a nobleman, and as far as their legal rights were concerned. Whether they became rich, that was up to them. But and that's, by the way, is one of the things that the revolution was fought for, to preserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What they meant by the pursuit of happiness was the pursuit of your trade or business, the thing that you did to create value that other people would want to pay for. That's what a business does. That's what we call professions now. There were no things called professions then. They were called trades. They upgraded themselves in the 19th century. They decided to become professions and make themselves more important. It was kind of like what the master tradesmen did in cities in Europe prior to the revolution, where they formed guilds, and you weren't allowed in a guild unless you met their rules. Anyway, the profession, things like medicine, law, they decided that they were learned professions. That's what they called themselves. And like law schools were created in the 19th century, and licensing of lawyers by states began. The original founders, most of them were lawyers, people like Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, but they weren't licensed by states. Of course, the states existed prior to the revolution. They were colonies, but they didn't have to get licenses to practice law. It was a process to do it, but the state was not involved. There was no involvement of the state in the creation of their profession. And it was a matter of whether people wanted to purchase their services. And freedom of contract gives what it does. It's a blessing. It's basically, it's part of our right to property. People were supposed to be allowed to have property, and for the property rights to be very strong. What was called fee simple absolute for real property, absolute ownership, where no one could take any part of your property right. Your home was your castle. No one could take any part of your property right. And if the state wanted to take your property, it couldn't do it. It had to pay for it. And that's why we have no taking of property by the state without due process of law. And all of those bureaucracies, what they do is they each have their own jurisdiction. Like the Interstate Commerce Commission was basically in charge of the railroad business. And one of the reasons it was able to get established was that the people that owned the railroads at the time, which had been built with enormous federal subsidies, by the way, the initial financing of the whole thing was very corrupting. But the federal government got involved in financing them because the creation of the railroad, we can't even imagine today how extraordinary that was. It made the difference between moving things, especially heavy things. It made it possible to move things and people in a way that had simply never been possible before. The closest thing to it previously was an ox cart or a horse-drawn carriage that required care and maintenance of the horses as well as the carriage, and could only go very slowly, really. And of course, it couldn't carry anything really heavy. That's what the railroads made possible. That's why they were so heavily subsidized, especially during the Civil War, where they could move heavy things like cannons. Heavy military equipment could be moved around in a railroad in a way that they simply could not be moved previously. Previously, they just had to be drawn by horses. So it was a very limited kind of thing. But the railroads, that was a really incredible invention. And the federal government couldn't wait to stick its nose into it. Politicians wanted to get a piece of the action, and the people that owned the railroads knew that the railroad business in Europe was under the thumb of bureaucracies. And what they wanted was having a bureaucracy there that they could control by buying the politicians that control the thing. Because at that time, the politicians still could control them. There was never any idea of these independent agencies that the politicians themselves couldn't control. But the railroad barons were very happy to have that. It kept competition out. It meant that any new competitor had to spend a fortune getting entrenched with the bureaucrats, because the bureaucrats had the power. If they wanted to do something new with their railroad, they had to get permission from the bureaucrats. That's what bureaucracies do. They create a society where you have to go to the government to get permission to do it. Now, very recently, there was a Supreme Court case, Trump v. Casa, in which Justice Barrett chastised these lower federal courts for issuing these nationwide injunctions forbidding the president from doing things, because the president was elected and these judges were not. And the judges were creatures of the laws that enacted them. And basically, the Constitution gives Congress the power to create the lower federal courts. The only court that's actually created in the Constitution is the Supreme Court. But Congress is given the power to create these lower courts, but their jurisdiction is basically limited to what Congress gives it, which is based on tradition also. We inherited a legal system under which there had been two systems of courts, courts of equity and courts of law. I won't go into all the history. But what these nationwide injunctions are, it's something that the courts of equity did, in which a judge acting without a jury would issue orders, but they could only do it to the litigants that were before them in the court. And what they've been doing in these nationwide injunctions is issuing an injunction that covers the president everywhere in the country, and it doesn't just affect the litigants that are there in the district where the judge is. And that there's simply no authority permitting it. And that's what Justice Barrett said, that basically there's a whole line of authority that permits what the judges can do. First, there's the Constitution that permits Congress to create the lower federal courts. Then there was the Judiciary Act of 1789 that actually created them. And that's what she was interpreting in that ruling. And there is nothing in the law prior to the existence of that Congress created and the president signed of America, prior to the Interstate Commerce Commission, of any of these bureaucracies with the power to dictate what businesses are allowed to do and to demand that businesses go to them to get permission to do things. That was the first one. So they're all unconstitutional. There's nothing that permits them in the Constitution. And by the way, each one of them has all three powers: legislative, executive, and judicial. And they can't function without that because they're issuing orders. Well, who gets to issue orders in America? Judges. But judges only can do it in the form that's permitted by the law. That's what Justice Barrett was saying in that case. And they simply, even judges that have been duly appointed and are permitted under the Constitution, they're not allowed to issue orders that go beyond their jurisdiction. Well, every one of these agencies, they issue orders and they demand that people come to them on bended knee and ask their permission to do things if they're in a business that's under their jurisdiction. And that recent opinion by the Justice Barrett shows that when there isn't a real legal basis for the existence of the agency, something beyond just Congress making it up on the fly, the courts can't do it. And these agencies, which are not even contemplated in the Constitution, there's nothing in there, nothing in the Constitution that permits the creation of these bureaucracies. And they are antithetical to the guarantee clause because of the fact that, particularly with the presence of these public employee unions, the president can't simply fire these people. There are all sorts of rules surrounding their contracts. And all of that interferes with what the power of the executive branch over its own employees is supposed to be. And there's nothing in the Constitution that permits the existence of these bureaucracies. And the way they continue to function is the fact that each person in this country only comes in front of one or two of these things. Most people only encounter the Internal Revenue Service. That's the only bureaucracy they encounter. But there are hundreds of them with millions of employees. And all those employees have the power to ruin the lives of citizens who get stuck having to deal with them. And one of the reasons that you don't hear people complaining about it is the people that know the most about it, the people that have been under their thumb, suffering from what they do, they can't say a thing. Because if they do, they can be utterly destroyed by these agencies which answer to no one and are completely strangers to the Constitution. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, please like this and send it to other people and watch my other videos. Thank you.